And I'd like to call Akin Owosina. Did I get it right this time?
Perfect, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Our Hydrology and Hydraulics Bureau Chief to present the water conditions report.
As Akin's preparing, I'd just like to thank him again for spending all day Monday at Big Cypress Basin and working with our Collier County partners.
It's always a pleasure, sir.
Great job.
Good morning. My name is Akin Owosina. I'm Chief of your Hydrology and Hydraulics Bureau. Today I'll be giving the water conditions report. In addition to a typical report, which covers the entire district state of the system with regards to rainfall, storage, and our operations, I've added a number of slides that highlight some special operations we are undertaking in response to the executive order and the emergency order by DEP on June 20th at the direction of the governor, and the state of emergency declared by the governor on July 9th. Those slides would come later in the presentation, and they'll show you special actions we're taking to help address the high water conditions in Lake Okeechobee. We're a rainfall-driven system, and as many of you know, we're always responding to either the rain that fell, the rain that's fallen, or the rain or lack thereof that we anticipate in the next several months. Following the record-setting May of this year, where we got 3 times the amount of rainfall we typically have in May, we had a little bit of respite in June. Despite having a fair amount of rain, it was less than average for June, and it kind of had provided us some opportunities to respond to the rainfalls from May. In addition, if you look at what we have for July, we've had, it's tracking roughly about where we expect it to be at this time. We're keeping a close attention to what's happening with that as we try to respond to the high water conditions. Okay. Looking at June, the distribution is just about as important of the total amount of rainfall we received. And for June, what we have is that as I mentioned, we're slightly below average for the month of June. Most of that rain fell north of the lake, and we had relatively low, just below normal, in the southern part of the system, including the water conservation areas and the lower east coast. Taking a look at the same picture for the entire wet season to date, I'd like to highlight a few things. The deepest blue you see there is in Martin, St. Lucie County area. In that area, they've received more than 200% of what's typical by now in the rainy season. What you'd see from the pattern of the colors is that most of the rain, again, has been in the EAA and north of the lake, with the southern part of the system lagging a little bit, but it's still been a relatively wet season to date. Looking at July to date, and I inserted this slide just to show the challenges we have. The color variation you see demonstrates the variability in the rainfall distribution across the district. While we've had some areas, such as the EAA, range from as high as 140% of normal to 165% of what we'll typically have by now in July, we've had some areas that are running just a little bit more than half of what we'll typically have. Fortunately for us, they've been in the lower east coast and the water conservation areas. There's a little bit also to just north of the lake. And as I speak later about the special operations we're undertaking, kind of note this image because it's kind of afforded us some opportunities to do some operations we typically would not have been able to. Going down the system, starting from the Kissimmee, most of the lakes to the north of the system are at or near their summer pool elevation. With the exception of Lake Kissimmee, which is above its summer pool elevation. And where part of the strategy we're implementing is trying to hold off water to the extent we can in a reasonable manner, still leaving enough of a buffer for rainfall in that area to ensure flood protection for the citizens who live in the area. But the action of letting the lake run a little bit high is to hold water so that it doesn't get into Lake Okeechobee. And if it's not in Lake Okeechobee, you don't have to discharge it. Looking at Lake Okeechobee, the lake currently is it's above 14.46. When I made this slide, it was 14.46, and it's increasing. It's increased by about 1/3 of a foot in the last 30 days, and almost by 0.2 in the last 7 days. In response to some of the actions we're taking, and in the fact that we've had a slight, reduction in some of the rains, we've had an ability to start dealing with the massive amounts of rains we had in May. One key thing to note with Lake Okeechobee, the Corps suspended discharges to the St. Lucie effective June 20th. And more recently also to the Caloosahatchee. But the net effect is that since July 5th, there hasn't been discharges from Lake Okeechobee as well to the Caloosahatchee. Now, both estuaries have received flows, but those are from local basin runoff. The Corps is working closely with multiple agencies, including us, and they're talking to members of the public about the status of that suspension. And at some point in time, I'm sure they'll notify us when conditions change. Looking at Lake Okeechobee itself, the red trace that stops roughly around July is the current year, the 2018 year. A couple of things I'd like to note is that that trace has been rising over the last 2 to 3 weeks. It's approaching conditions we had around the same time in 2016. But also on this graphic, I'd just like to point one thing out, that all it takes is one event, and you could see a rapid increase in what's happening to lake level. So we track this very, very carefully, and it features prominently in our conversations with water managers, both at the district and at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Lower East Coast operations. As I mentioned earlier, the distribution of the rainfall has kind of favored us a little bit here. The canals in the lower East Coast typically are prioritized to take runoff. But as the runoff events reduce due to reducing rainfalls, the capacity that's created is maximized to move as much water out of the water conservation areas as we can, and that's what we're doing at this time. Looking at the rest of the system and the traffic light graphic that we use, just remember that this product looks a week in arrears, and so the particular colors represent the period between July 3rd and 9th. It shows us which areas were constrained to moving water south, and as you'll see, the map is plastered in red. Everything was essentially about a constraint. The EAA canals were dedicated to taking runoff in the EAA. Those have begun to free up, and we're taking advantage of them at this time. The STAs are treating runoff and have little capacity for lake water. And each of the 3 water conservation areas are currently above schedule. We're taking actions to bring this down, or at least stabilize the water levels within the conservation areas. I would point out that conservation area 2 is currently below the revised exception that we have for that conservation areas. But all in all, we're operating to keep the water conservation areas as low as we can get them back to schedule, and create some capacity to be able to move water south. A couple of important notes, and I think Mr. Akosio, before you ask me this question, the S12s are open, the C and D, and they've been open for a little bit now. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have received authorization to open A and B effective Friday 13th, which is tomorrow, a couple of days ahead of the scheduled opening. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 emergency orders that have given us some flexibility to expedite, cut through some of the bureaucracy, and take some actions that we maybe typically might not have been able to. The first was issued by Department of Environmental Protection in June, I think June 20th it was, at the direction of the governor. And the second is associated to a state of emergency declared by the governor, and the associated executive order. Those copies of the 2 documents. Before I launch into the details of the operations, I thought I'd take a minute or 2 to highlight some things that are important to understand. Operations of the flood system in the district, the area we cover, is a joint series of operations by many organizations. Primarily for the water conservation areas, it's our organization, the Water Management District, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. What this graphic shows is a series of structures or assets that are available to us to move water out to tide from the water conservation areas or move it between the water conservation areas. The ones in red are operated by the district, your staff, and the ones in orange are operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they move water through the water conservation areas into the Everglades National Park. The key reason why I'm showing this is that for all of this to work, there has to be tight coordination, and our water managers, and those at the core, talk frequently. They meet daily, and our staff also talks to executive leadership on decisions that we're trying to make that are out of the norm to address the high water situation. Before going into details, I was thinking this morning that perhaps it might be helpful to provide a lay description of the strategy that we're implementing. It's a four-pronged approach, and in the simplest terms, it's geared at keeping water out of Lake Okeechobee, because if it's not in there, you don't have to discharge it. We're taking actions north of the lake. We're taking actions in other areas that contribute flows to Lake Okeechobee, such as the L8. And we're taking advantage of storage, both especially in areas north of the lakes, part of the dispatch project. We're taking actions to prioritize or to move flows south. And there'll be a few things that I'll discuss that show how we've prioritized moving water south out of Lake Okeechobee. For this to be able to work, we had to create room in the areas south. So we're taking actions to evacuate as much as we can out of the water conservation areas. I'm sure there's a fourth thing that shows up in my notes, but it happens that way, sometimes it goes. But it's a four-pronged, and if I remember that before I finish, I'll tell you what that fourth prong is. So what are those ongoing activities? Regarding reducing inflows into Lake Okeechobee, where possible, we've taken some actions in the L8 Basin to redirect flows away from the L8 Canal to the extent possible, and therefore keep it out of backflowing into Lake Okeechobee. And also L8 runoff that we've prioritized using the S5As and C51 to route those out to tide. We're moving water to tide as rapidly as we can, using all canals and assets that we have, including the Hillsborough, North New River, and the Miami canals. We are using storage, both publicly owned, such as the A1 FEB and the L8 FEB, and those that were privately held as part of the dispersed water programs. We're taking advantage of every opportunity to store water, either to prevent it from getting into the lake or to give the lake room to send some of that water to without getting to the estuary. We're using structures that we have to move water both into the North New River Canal to tide. I'll describe in a minute some of the activities we're taking with pump stations to move those also into places where we can get them to structures that will move them to tide, as well as actions we're taking in the southern part of the system in preparation for decisions that we think are imminent to allow the L29 to rise above 8 to about 8 and a third or 8.3 or thereabout. But we're taking lots of actions right now, and this is just a cross-section of some of those that are current. There are one or two that are not on this list. There were actions we initiated earlier on when we started the response that we have had to stop because of local rainfall, and reprioritizing those pathways to deal with the local runoff. As soon as those conditions change, we will revisit those decisions again, and we may re-initiate those actions. Regarding pump stations, we've put in a number of temporary pumps. This slide summarizes where they are. I mentioned earlier some of the actions we're taking to reduce L8 runoff, and the first bullet on here talks about actions we're taking around Corbett to move the L8 water through the C18 canal instead of getting it into the L8 canal itself. We're moving water from water conservation area 3A and B, actually into 3B from 3A, but also we're moving water out of conservation area 3A using pumps that we've installed, and we're moving water south and east wherever we can, east being to tide. Let's see if I can get this mouse to show you some of the locations. The yellow dots or the orange dots that you're looking at there represent the location of the pumps that I've summarized in these tables. And in this table, I've also shown the capacities that we've had. One of the key ones, and I have a few slides that'll expand more on this, is the operation we've initiated in Water Conservation Area 2A and 1A. We've used two 42-inch temporary pumps to move water from 2A into 1. And from there, we've been able to use S39 structure to release those flows into the Hillsborough Canal to head into tide. And that's what you see in these three photographs. The one to the top and your left represents the intake part of the system, where we have the temporary pumps taking water across the L39 levee from Water Conservation Area 2 into Water Conservation Area 1, close to the spillway structure. The middle image shows you the tail, the discharge from those pumps, and the bottom picture and to the right shows the structure open, looking downstream to the Hillsborough Canal. What I have next is a short video clip that we've put together to talk about these temporary pump operations that we're having. It's the gentleman, the talent on the screen is Tom DeBolt, one of my colleagues from the operations side of the shop. Rescued.
The emergency temporary pumps behind us are moving water from Conservation Area 2 to Conservation Area 1 and then immediately to tide through the Hillsborough Canal. These pumps increase the storage capacity to the south, which allows even further water to be moved south given the current wet conditions. Behind us here, this is the S39 structure. This releases water from Water Conservation Area 1, also known as the Arthur Marshall Loxahatchee Wildlife Refuge. The water then flows east through the Hillsborough Canal to tide.
Okay. Our communication staff has used several social media channels to share information on the actions that we're taking with the public through Twitter, through video interviews that have been posted onto the web. This is just a slideshot of a number of the various interviews and information that we have put out. But all of this information, as well as other information about our response to the high water events, can be found on this website, and I'd encourage everybody to spend some time taking a look at this. There's a whole lot of information beyond what I've talked about today that you can find here, including the sequence of our actions in the last 3 or 4 interviews, I think, that are currently posted. You can go to the district, the link below, sfwmd.gov/managing high water. So as not to leave on a sour note, I thought I'd share something with you, and I talked to 1 or 2 of my staff, and they said it was bordering on desperation. But what we're looking at is the CPC Outlook for the next several months. The first shows the month of July, and the CPC projections are still for higher chances of wetter than normal. Meteorologists, though, have a slightly different projections. They anticipate about the next 2 weeks that we will have slightly drier conditions, and I'm hoping that they are correct. The CPC projections for the 3-month window, July to September and August to October, dropped from where they were last month, which was a higher likelihood of above normal rainfall, to now equal chances of wet, dry, and normal conditions. I know it's a punt, but when you need good news, you find it where you can. So